They have bad marriage advice, Southeast Christian Church. They're implying that, well, they outright stated that you have to be spiritual in order to have a successful marriage. When she turns to her hope to God, God gives her success. And that's from Genesis 29:32 through 34. Rules without a relationship leads to rebellion. Rules with a relationship can also lead to rebellion. They don't want to get into the topic of abusive spouses because then you start to realize you're immersed in Stockholm Syndrome within the church and you're in an abusive relationship in the church. Jesus is your father. Creepy. October 8th, 2006. Priests were allowed to eat a portion of the sacrifice animals. So this is just an early form of, it's one of the earliest forms of just the religious authorities mooching off of everybody else. This is 1 Samuel 2:17. Then they have the stages of training up children. Yeah, the church is a really reliable source when it comes to raising children. Discipline from birth to 5. That's right, you're disciplining a 4-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 2-year-old, or a 1-year-old. Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9. Whenever the New Testament fails to provide material for a lesson that they want to teach, they have to return to the Old Testament. Because the quote mining doesn't always, and cherry picking doesn't always work with the New Testament, so they have to turn to the Old Testament. Of course, when you bring up the Old Testament being fulfilled and no longer being a source that you can turn to for commandments, that's when they say, oh, the Old Testament is still in place. And then when you turn to the Old Testament to point out the war crimes and stuff of Israel and that were done in God's name, or that supposedly God did, or that supposedly even happened, that's when they start to go, oh, well, the Old Testament is no longer fully in place. So it's situational. It depends on how they, what message they're trying to shove at people on a given day. And then the really creepy ones are the ones that say the Old Testament is in place and the atrocities that were committed in the Old Testament were perfectly justifiable. And they have no problem being labeled a terrorist or anything else. They just hold to those opinions because they can get away with it. And they have no threat of any kind of outside source doing anything to them because of those beliefs, because they think they're untouchable. And that's where you go, huh, oh, I guess the Constitution really didn't do enough to protect sane people from unsane people. I mean, really, what has the Constitution done to protect people? It's a-religious, and it's meant to protect people from religion and give people freedom from religion, but it has absolutely no power when it comes down to it. So you've got all these people running around who are theists, and who are endangering everybody else. You've got essentially people who are Christian Taliban that are still able to do what they want in most cases, and who are still pushing for even more power, and who have nobody who is checking that power. Only one command, honor and obey parents, is directed towards children. All the rest are directed towards parents, because children are just expected to be serfs or fiefs or slaves or property of their parents. I mean, it's right in here. My mom is like, well, Jesus loves his little children, and, you know, the Bible is child-friendly and stuff. It's like, no, it's not. It's immersed in an old world, a time where, well, some people, not the majority of the world, but a certain powerful sect in certain areas of the world was cruel towards children, and that's the only records that they want to go by, and so they assume that that's the way it was globally. You know, there's other records that show different treatment towards children, and kinder treatment of children, or elevation of children to, you know, a more deific stance, and then that didn't get appropriated till Christianity set in, you know, years and years later. Proverbs 22:6. Train a child and he probably won't deviate. The exception being me. This was in September 25th, 2006. Marriage is a picture of Christ in the church, so naturally the man has to have more power than the woman. So does that mean the woman being the church, does that mean she's supposed to be like really cruel and manipulative and using her power to get money and more power? It's like the picture that the church has of women is just creepy. God always used weak animals. He literally used a lion in some cases. A donkey is not exactly what you'd call weak. I mean, it's a beast of burden, for crying out loud. They've got horses mentioned in the Bible, which are, you know, synonymous, I think, are mentioned explicitly in the Bible as being powerful creatures. God shows the foolish things to shame the wise. They didn't follow up with an explanation for what they meant by that. So it just ends up being a koan. Satan doubts, denies, and distorts God's command, word, and character. See, this is where some atheists go, you know, all these personifications into demonic or supernatural characters that are negative of all these traits is really just a way of trying to gaslight people into acting like any opposition is supernatural and negative to anything that they have to say. When in reality, it's just people going, wait a second, this doesn't make sense. Like, literally, none of it does. And it's self-contradictory, and on and on and on. Alright, it says, evil is abnormal, not part of God's original creation, except in Isaiah where it says that God creates evil. Evil comes from the outside source of Satan. Of course, they just stop right there and go, and don't follow through with the logical conclusion of, okay, so who created Satan? And the moral of the story is Adam was created first, woman was to be under his authority. Which is just absurd when you consider the variability between married couples. That sometimes, shockingly enough, the woman can be smarter or more powerful or stronger than the man in some areas or in all of the areas. Which, don't tell that to any Christian, because they'll just lose their minds or just scoff at you. It's not going to have any impact. Don't bother. There's this trick that Christianity uses, and that really any religion uses, which is to say everything else is a religion, but ours isn't a religion, it's a relationship. And the way that they get around that is they say religion is the acts of man, whereas ours is the acts of the real, true supernatural stuff. It says, this is verbatim, they tried to use man's effort to cover their sin, the first instance of religion. So they're basically trying to say that everything else is fake, but we have the real thing, the non-religious thing. So all the supernatural and all the ritualistic trappings, those are just coincidence. That we look like religion and we act like religion, it smells like a religion. We're totally not a religion. God's walking form was Jesus. So was this baby Jesus or adult Jesus or post-crucifixion Jesus? They don't say. They just like to drop these things out drop these things without any scriptural backing. And now for creepy cult quotes from Christianity. Man without Christ is the seed of the serpent. I'm pretty sure they just called me snake sperm. John 8. Jews say they are free. All who sin are a slave to sin. Jesus frees sinners. So here we've got a reversal of reality, which is slavery is freedom, freedom is slavery. So if you're tithing, as they say in later sermons, going beyond like a third of your income, all of your income, that's not slavery. Having a debt that you can't pay back, an infinite debt that you've got to work to repay but you can't repay, that's not slavery. The role of women to men and children to their parents, that's not slavery. It's sin. Sin is what's slavery. Yeah. The devil is your father, the father of lies. That's coming from Jesus. So, basically, I don't have anything to follow up with that. It's basically, if you're an atheist or if you don't go with the plan, then you're a seed of Satan and you're just naturally a liar. You can say that about anybody, though. Like, as long as as long as you state beforehand that you don't have anything, you don't have a need to prove your credibility, you can say that about anybody. You're a liar because I said so, and I'm super great, so that means that anything I say is true. Okay, October 14th, Saturday at 1 to 3 p.m. No, that can't be right. October 2nd, 2006. We are clothed with Christ as man was covered in skin. So is this like a Buffalo Bill type of clothing? Like your Jesus skin suit? Hebrews 2. Man rules creation. Jesus rules creation better. We have seen what happens when we have Christian rulers. I mean, literally everybody in Congress is either a Christian or a religious person of some sort. And it has been that way since, well, probably since the early 1800s. There were some people who were like Unitarians and Universalists back during the Founding Fathers, but we haven't seen people like that too often since then. And people just continue to talk about how much they hate Congress and disapprove of them, and yet they keep electing the same people over and over again. Romans 16:18 through 20, men are slaves to worldly things. This is coming from a book that like endorses and defines how slavery should be conducted. Not outlaws slavery, but says, hey, you got slaves. Let me show you how it's done. And again, it's like you ruling your life as you see fit and living your life according to what's right in your own eyes. That's slavery. Having someone else dictate to you exactly what you're supposed to be doing all the time and what you're supposed to be thinking and what you're supposed to be feeling, that's not slavery. That's freedom. So after Revelation, animals will be at peace with each other. Good luck reconciling the carnivores and obligate carnivores. He couldn't be a lunatic because his apostles died for him. All we've got for that is Catholic Church tradition, and Southeast Christian Church isn't Catholic. They like to pick which myths and urban legends from throughout history they're going to go by. And of course it's going to be the ones that back up the church's position on issues. Legend. Encyclopedia Britannica, non-religious historians acknowledges his existence and events. So here they wouldn't even present the views of people who go, wait a second, the sources that you're claiming say that Jesus exists, those were written hundreds of years afterwards, and all you've got is a religious text, not a historical one. So they didn't even acknowledge. I didn't even realize there were people who didn't, who disclaimed the existence of Christ, which is the opinion or the fact that we've got now, which is that the whole thing was totally bogus and Jesus was an amalgam written by multiple authors over a protracted series of books over a protracted length of time. What did Jesus back up his claims with? Fulfillment of prophecies. So the comic book says that the comic book is true, therefore the comic book is true. Braveheart, based on true events, except with a bajillion liberties taken. You see that a lot in, tons of works of fiction, and we don't give any more credence to The Lord of the Rings than we do to books on science. Yet another origin of Jesus' crucifixion, cause of death, and yet another thing that doesn't jibe with the other descriptions that they've got. I am not making much headway in these notes, but it's just I keep getting stuck on stuff that I now realize is bogus. Romans 10:9, you must believe this. You must believe like in the resurrection, or else. You don't get the goodies after death. Oh no. Your totally made up thing that you have no evidence for isn't going to get rewarded to people who don't believe in the resurrection. So the magical thing isn't going to be granted to you unless you believe in the other magical thing. Oh no. And then they've got the straw man of, well, what if there was a variant on the crucifixion story? It's just more of the same. 2 Timothy 3:13-15, all scripture is God-breathed. This becomes a problem when you start looking at all the errors, grammatical and otherwise, contradictions, when you start looking in depth at the New Testament and you really start reading it, the stuff starts standing out at you how much it was written by men and not by anything supernatural. And just the number of revisions it went through and translations over the years, and how little of it comes even close to something that could be God-inspired. Malachi, God says he hates divorce, and this is why my mom is married to someone who's semi-abusive of her. And why it applies to a lot of people, where they're just locked into this abusive relationship with their spouse because the church doesn't approve of divorce. It's like, way to go, church. You're making another person's life miserable. Yeah. If you understand Christ and the church, your marriage will thrive. Or you'll just be we know what the nature of Christian marriages is. We know how many people get divorced who are Christians. We know that a lot of people who are in Christian marriages are miserable, but they're not allowed to get out of them. And that's because of the church. It's because of scriptures like Malachi. It's not just the church. It's the text which they're based on. The texts aren't going anywhere. It's the church and the texts that are the problem, jointly. Mostly the text, though. If you abandon the text, then, well, you get liberal churches and progressive churches. In which case, what's the point? Just have your own social groups and don't be beholden to organized, structured social constructs like that. This is from September 11th, 2006. More misinformation. If the universe is eternal, we couldn't be here. And this is just something that, they float by. It's just like, okay, here's this fun fact. We're not going to explain it or back it up. And it's gone. And you're just sitting there waiting for the justification for what they've just said, and it's never going to come. It's just going to be added up onto the pile of cumulative things that are presented as facts that you're just supposed to accept. And if you don't, then you're a bad person or not a real Christian. Proverbs 8:27. They literally say here, God inscribes a circle on the face of the deep. A circle. They don't say sphere, they say circle. This is where I confront people with this verse, and they say, well, that just means a sphere. Or they're talking about the horizon. And it's like, no, that's not what it says here. It's inscribe a circle. The shape of the earth, according to the Bible, is a circle, and if you believe anything else, then you're not a real Christian. Going back in time to August 2nd, 2006. I've been thorough about taking notes, if you haven't noticed by now. Does it say don't grump? Don't grudge? Don't grudge against other Christians. James 5, 7 through 11. It's kind of like the usury laws that later got passed in the 1300s in England. Heaven's rewards are worth waiting for. We don't actually have to demonstrate any of them exist. Just buy it. James 5 through 9. When we ask, let's see, quote, grumble and you will be judged for it. So basically if you go, hey, I've got a problem with what the church is doing, you will be punished. First John chapter 3, you will receive death if you don't love. That sounds healthy. Romans, sufferings here don't compare with future suffering. More terroristic threatening. Us, when God was speaking of let us make man in our own image, us refers to the Trinity, not mentioned until way later. Because Jesus is the God-man go-between, is personal. No, the us referred to multiple gods creating the earth, and monotheism didn't set in until later. You've got a story of creation that is in the process of evolving into a different story. You've got a polytheistic story evolving into a monotheistic story, or stories. You can't prove you're a Christian by saying so, or by politics, or by doctrine, or by moral superiority, or by church membership. I'm assuming that the conclusion, I didn't write down what the conclusion was, because they probably didn't give it. I'm guessing it's because the church defines who is a Christian and who isn't. Or the real Christians get to say who is and who isn't a Christian. Jesus loved us by sacrifice. 1 Corinthians, without love you're loud and annoying. So replace the word love there with sacrifice and you become without sacrifice you're loud and annoying. So give your money to us, the church. Shift from 1 hour a week to a way of life. It's just, I mean, how much more obvious can it get that the church just wants to turn you into its slave? John 3:18, serve. And then we had a whole sermon on how the church grows. This is when the church was pushing for a multi-site campus. So pretty much the whole thing was their pitch on what they're going to do with the money, and why they're going to do it. So they didn't have the commandment to sacrifice and stuff, I guess, because this was early on in the planning phase. And it started really hitting you up later. And I've talked about that in my other videos, about how every single sermon pretty much I was going to have that push for donating more money and stuff. Alright, I'm just going to end the video here.